Neither the declassified documents nor any of the government hearings throughout the 70s ever followed up on what the real goal of this sub-project was. Dr. Jose Delgado is a good place to start. His name appears at least a dozen times in Sol Cell's bioelectronic directories. The general public is more familiar with Delgado's experiments than nearly any other that has been connected to the CIA's secretive MKUltra objectives.
Here we see the normal, highly aggressive behavior of a healthy bull in a small bull ring.
For the scientists who were attempting to decode the central nervous system, electrical stimulation of the brain became a natural extension of the original experiments with electricity that Galvani, Volta, and others had used to trigger muscle contractions in frogs at the tail end of the 18th century. By the time Dr. Jose Delgado stepped into the ring, he didn't need the customary red cape anymore. Only a remote control.
Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado is financed by the Office of Naval Research.
Delgado had implanted a series of electrodes into the aggression center of a bull's brain. And then he invited the press.
The electrodes are attached to a small transistorized electrical stimulator, which is cemented to the bull's skull. The electrical stimulator in the skull responds to radio stimulation, so the bull is literally subject to remote control.
Delgado has remote control of the animal.
When the remote control apparatus is operated and the bull's caudate nucleus is stimulated, the bull becomes non-aggressive.
Stopping the charging animal now only required the push of a button.
According to Marcuse, inner freedom designates the private space in which man may become and remain himself. Today, this private space has been invaded and whittled down by technological reality.
The techno-matador spectacle, which made headline upon controversial headline in 1966, was meant to shock people, to put humans in their place. But at this point in his career, Dr. Delgado was just showing off his ability to remote control the bull. He had been implanting electrodes in different centers of the brain since the early 1950s. By demonstrating that he could turn a bull on and off like a toy, in what observers could have been forgiven for mistaking as high-tech voodoo, Delgado apparently fancied himself the ultimate matador.
Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man.
But the good doctor was only one of a network of neurophysiologists and psychiatrists running parallel research programs across the U.S. and the world. Cybernetician Warren McCullough was also among the earliest pioneers of deep electrode stimulation in the 30s at the Yale Laboratory of Neurophysiology, establishing the profound connection between the thalamus buried inside the brain and the outer sensory cortex that Wilder Penfield first explored.
The master control for the whole body resides in the brain, and the new methodology of implanted electrodes has provided direct access to the centers which regulate most of the body's activities.
But by the end of the half-century mark, things were honed into an operable science, and McGill would once again prove to be groundbreaking in decoding the inner brain. While Professor Donald Hebb was busy exploring the mechanisms of neural networks and the effects of isolation upon the mind, in part for the CIA, his postdoctoral students James Olds and Peter Milner were stumbling upon their own findings, which would prove to be pivotal. Although it had been accidental at first, Olds and Milner had discovered the so-called pleasure center of the brain through an extension of the technique Wilder Penfield first developed.
A new window on the brain was opened in 1953, when a rat fortuitously evidenced a neuro-rewarding effect. By returning to the place where he had been when an electrical stimulus was applied to the brain via chronically implanted electrodes.
In terms of conditioned behavior, this electrically induced reward became an end unto itself. In 1954, Olds created a reward map of the brain featuring locations where electrical stimulation caused mammals to come back for more. The reward map held true for rats, cats, monkeys, and humans. By 1961, James Olds, who'd been attending Macy's sister conferences on the central nervous system during the late 50s alongside Frank Fremont Smith, Howard Liddell, and other cybernetics acolytes, made history after he implanted an electrode into the pleasure center of a lab rat's brain and conditioned it to trigger its own self-satisfying electrical stimulation.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet.
By pressing a simple lever.
Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on.
Within this cybernetic loop of electric stimulus and reward, Olds and Milner's experimental rats quickly succumbed to self-stimulating their own brains repeatedly, thousands of times, foregoing their own natural drives for hunger, sex, and even willingly enduring immense pain.
Now, I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain.
Rats implanted with these electrodes continue to push and push and push the lever again and again and again, even until the point of death, just to receive this stimulating electrical reward. Clearly, these researchers had uncovered something with far-reaching implications.
This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
In 1953, this series of therapeutic research experiments was conducted by Dr. Robert Heath of Tulane University. His subjects responded to electrical stimulation of isolated brain centers implanted with electrodes. We see here the possibility for direct physical manipulation of the mind and personality.
What do you think? If you do it too much, does it have any bad effects on you?
No bad effects at all.
Most of the scientists who conduct these experiments say that because they do not yet understand enough about the brain, these techniques should not be used on humans. But this man says they should. He is Dr. Robert Heath of Tulane University Medical School in New Orleans.
Famously, he claims to have turned down the CIA when the agency approached him about conducting covert research into the pain and pleasure centers of the brain. Reportedly offended at the abhorrent suggestion, he was quoted in dozens of papers as saying,
"I took the stand that if I wanted to be a spy, I'd be a spy. I wanted to be a doctor and practice medicine."
But in reality, Dr. Robert G. Heath had been investigating the effects of mind-altering surgeries and substances for the government since at least 1943, when as a military psychiatrist and chief resident at the Neurological Institute in New York tied to Columbia University, he performed experimental leucotomies and tested ergotamine tartrate, a precursor to LSD derived from ergot, on war-weary, psychologically stressed merchant marines. Curiously, despite the fact that practically nothing has been mentioned about it since, the press billed the experimental ergot treatment as a miracle cure for shell shock that could permanently relieve symptoms in a mere 2 hours. By 1949, Dr. Heath was made head of Tulane's newly created Neurology and Psychiatry Department, and while the exact relationship remains unclear at this point, what is clear is that sometime during the early days of the CIA and military prodding into mind control through top-secret projects like Bluebird, Artichoke, and Chatter, Dr. Robert Heath was again tapped to go further than ever before in testing LSD, mescaline, and other mind-altering chemicals on his human patients. Dr. Heath carried out his research in the name of battling schizophrenia and mental disorders, which afforded him an endless supply of human test subjects. From the Tulane Medical School where he housed his labs, from the imposing charity hospital across the street, from the remote East Louisiana State Hospital hours away in rural Jackson, and even from the notorious Alcatraz of the South, Angola Prison. Because existing treatments had failed these patients, almost any experimental technique could be justified in their cases, although there is little evidence that Heath's experiments were actually therapeutic. By 1952, Dr. Heath had already outfitted nearly 24 mental patients with semi-permanent electrodes in their brains.
Yeah, I just feel like I don't have any thoughts like a human being. I'm just an animal walking around on the earth. Please don't do me like this. Please don't. I can't stand it. I don't like to feel like this.
Look at that smile you got now.
Why does that make me do that? I don't like to do that.
You really told me off, remember?
I know I did, but I couldn't help it.
In spite of all this, Heath's results were promising, at least to the intelligence community anyway. A 1954 volume published through Harvard Press with funding from the Commonwealth Fund, later revealed as a CIA cutout, included details about Heath's research presented at a symposium which attracted participation from other notables in the field. That same year, Dr. Heath was invited to Edgewood Arsenal, where he was a keynote speaker at an Army Chemical Corps event and discussed the progression of his work with electrical stimulation and recording in the brain of man. Perhaps not so coincidentally, Tulane University reportedly signed off on a facility security clearance for Heath's entire department afterwards.
Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain.
FOIA documents would later reveal that Heath also took a CIA contract in 1955 to study the effects of the drug bulvocapnine, allegedly being tested by the Soviets to induce stupor and break willpower. For his test subjects, Heath pulled a couple of otherwise healthy prisoners from Angola. The bulk of Dr. Heath's work and of the resources of Tulane Medical School were not just focused on the testing of drugs, but the altering of human behavior. This took on a decided focus with Dr. Heath's obsession over the septal area, a rather pliable part of the limbic system near the amygdala, where he believed schizophrenics may have had an imbalance, and where he found excitatory pleasure and inhibitory pain could be systematically elicited on an electrode's command.
Now, as a patient at a New Orleans hospital, he has had electrodes implanted deep within his brain for a year and a half. In that time, he has been given a new personality.
Dr. Heath paralleled in the human mind the old concept of the self-stimulating rat, in some cases turning over the control to his electrode-implanted mental patients.
Dr. Heath inserted electrodes in the region of her brain he thought might be associated with pleasure.
Who quickly learned that they could mitigate pain or induce a deep-seated pleasure or even sexual arousal with the push of a button.
Find this button, yes.
That's number 2 button.
Most pleasurable.
How do you feel? You're trying to tell me how it excites you, is that it?
Oh, I think it's someone with a sexy button.
Down long Louisiana roads boiling hot in the summer heat. On the path to remote mental wards and prisons, the ethical dilemmas were beyond blatant. Hospital administrators and wardens proved all too willing to give access for human experimentation that would have been unacceptable not just under the Nuremberg codes, but standard American practice at the time. Dr. Heath also notoriously attempted to convert a homosexual man using brain stimulation to trigger his sexual centers in the presence of a female prostitute. Despite the highly publicized claim that he didn't want to be a spy, Dr. Heath was also attending symposiums on topics such as hallucinations, among many who would later be exposed as MK-Ultra subproject heads, including Dr. Maitland Baldwin of Subproject 62, Dr. Martin Orne of Subproject 84, and Dr. Louis Jolyon West of Subproject 43.
There's no way that I can see that it could be abused or misused. The control is in his hands.
But some people fear that the control won't stay in the patient's hands, that electrical stimulation could be used to manipulate people rather than to treat mental illness.
By placing electrodes deep within the brain, investigators, including Dr. Jose Delgado of Yale University, have located precise regions that activate emotions such as fear and rage, and basic drives such as hunger and sex. Electrodes can carry currents into the brain and allow the scientist to control behavior.
By the end of the 50s, the art of brain stimulation had advanced from long, conspicuous wire leads to more discreet remote control technology, and Delgado had virtually mastered an elaborate program of behavior modifications which he demonstrated in his monkeys.
The motor cortex is probably like a large keyboard, able to play the strings of muscular contraction and to produce movements.
In his Yale laboratory, Dr. Delgado has gone even further. By pushing a button, he controls life in a colony of monkeys. He can direct their behavior and change the neatly ordered structure of their society.
Delgado could turn everything from emotions to actions on and off like a light switch. Flipping it on, Delgado could, for example, adjust the diameter of a monkey's pupil as if it were the iris of a camera, constricting one eye and dilating the other with great precision by varying signal strength sent to the hypothalamus. Anger, arousal, fear, or sleep could be dialed up just as easily. He called his device a stimoceiver.
We are used to the idea that machines can be controlled from a distance by means of radio signals. Garage doors can be opened or closed. Channels and volume of a TV set can be adjusted from an armchair. Even orbiting capsules can be directed from tracking stations on Earth. But perhaps it is still surprising to learn that we may also control the biological functions of living organisms from a distance.
Newspapers both repulsed and gripped the public with just how much control a little electricity had upon the brain. Dr. Delgado found his stimocevers could even induce mothers to ignore their young on command. The electrode signals were so compelling and so precise, in fact, that Delgado was able to reliably provoke a single monkey into carrying out a complex series of 12 actions that led to attacking a rival monkey. When a computer-programmed signal was sent to the monkey's stimoceiver, the monkey predictably carried out the same sequence of actions in the exact same order every single time, 20,000 times in a row.
Cats, monkeys, or human beings can be induced to flex a limb, to reject food, or to feel emotional excitement under the influence of electrical impulses reaching the depths of their brains through radio waves purposely sent by an investigator.
Just to make a point, Delgado also turned the controls over to the colony as well, and the normally subservient monkeys were able to push a button and suppress the aggression of the most dominant one, and freely roam around his territory and even mock him to his face, demonstrating that brain stimulation could upend order in the primate world. But of course, Delgado's ambitions weren't ultimately focused just on the primate world.
But when violence strikes, then those in public responsibility have an immediate and a very different job, not to analyze, but to end disorder. $200 million Americans did not strike down Robert Kennedy last night, any more than they struck down President John F. Kennedy in 1963, or Dr. Martin Luther King in April of this year. But those awful events give us ample warning that in a climate of extremism, of contempt for the rights of others, of disrespect for law, violence may bring down the very best among us. A nation that tolerates violence in any form cannot expect to be able to confine it to just minor outbursts. The violence must be stopped quickly, finally.